Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. I would have liked to have been in attendance there in Shanghai, and I hope that there will be soon other opportunities for further exchange. In this presentation, I will explore the issue of global of called cultural diversity in education policy and practice, and I will be arguing that teacher education can play a major role in recognizing cultural diversity, promoting dialogue among individuals and groups, and implementing global citizenship education. I will also argue that global citizenship education could be a perfect paradigm to frame this intercultural approach within teacher education, provided that global citizenship education is adopted in a non neutral perspective from a policy and political point of view. After an introduction discussing differences between multiculturalism and interculturalism in education, some criticism will be raised on these culture based models. A global approach to education is suggested to overcome the contradictions of intercultural, multicultural models. Then, the global citizenship education in European contexts will be briefly presented to highlight the role of this approach in teacher education specifically. Finally, I will just mention two examples of cross-cultural course on global citizenship education competence and one on intercultural teacher education, but I presume I do not have time to go too much in detail in these two examples. Uh, Unlike multiculturalism and multicultural education, which prevail in North America and in many parts of the world, the intercultural model is one of the mainstream in education policy in Europe. In a book I co authored with my colleague Carlos Alberto Torres, we argued that multicultural model has had the undeniable merit of moving the category of diversity from the margins to the mainstream in the social and political interpretation of contemporary society. However, it has offered a univocal response to manifold challenges. One could argue that there are parallels between both sets of practice and traditions. And indeed, the two terms are often considered synonymous in their application to education. The focus of both concepts is related but not identical, and it is related to a collective identity based on the ambiguous concept of culture. Nevertheless, interculturalism, addressing mostly the question of social integration of immigrants, is an attempt to create intercultural mediation based on a flexible idea of culture and seeking a new idea of citizenship based on intercultural negotiation that call cultures, assumptions, values, and beliefs. Although the concept of intercultural education has been extensively discussed in its political and pedagogical significance, especially in Europe, it can be said that it considers cultural diversity as an educational resource rather than a problem to be solved, and assigns an educational priority to the development of identity, including cultural identity. Is an approach that does not seek to assimilate those who are culturally other within a given order, but attempts to reorganize the public sphere so that it can reflect the constitutive diversity of contemporary society. Cultural anthropology, postmodern thinking, and postcolonial approaches have produced new vision that emphasize mixing rather than collective difference. They consider ethnic identities as always multiple, hybrid, and mobile. Moreover, intersectional perspectives show that no social category alone is sufficient to explain complex phenomena of identity, building, and forms of discrimination. However, cultural diversity cannot be eliminated as one of the substantive ways to define our individual and collective identities. But according to constructive multiculturalism, according to our claims, Torres and myself, according to this constructive multiculturalism, culture is not the only dimension that constitutes a collective individual identities. Moreover, cultures are not monolithic entities, but they have rich internal variety and difference, tensions, and contradictions. Therefore, to establish any kind of intercultural dialogue, one must choose those aspects of a culture that, to quote De Souza Santos, represent the widest circle of reciprocity within that culture, the version that goes furthest in recognition of the others. End quotation. In Europe, intercultural education has been a response to the recent issue of immigration and not a model for integration of linguistic and cultural minorities. Immigration is considered a key issue both at the European level and by every nation state, which require appropriate responses from the education policy. The forced migrant is the most realistic emblematic condition of the planetary economy and culture nowadays, and globalization create the economic, technical, and cultural conditions for migration. In spite of political discourse dominant in Western societies that tend to portray immigration as a negative but stoppable byproduct of globalization, cultural diversity and multiple identities are constitutive elements of our societies. Educational institutions are structurally plural, and diversity cannot be seen as an emergency, but as a structural sign of heterogeneity within which educators, policymakers, and scholars have to deal with. In this scenario, new educational challenges take shape. A relativization of the Western centered way to represent the world, the emergence of social equality, inequality, discrimination, and racism within nationalistic society, and the need to rethink education for a post national citizenship. Against this background, cultural diversity, especially the one generated by global migration, is a key issue for global citizenship education as well, because it poses the questions in terms of global mobility and inequality between and within the nations. Since the first decade of the 21st century, for different reasons, both the multicultural and intercultural education approach have shown signs of historical, political, and pedagogical crisis. Multiculturalism, which has never been a real policy in any European country, has in the last 2 decades been ferociously opposed by nationalist parties and far right political movements, challenged by neoliberal conservatives and for different reasons by some progressive scholars. Not to mention that then that it was criticized from a practical point of view because of the failure of its practice. In particular, in the last 2 decades, several countries where some multicultural policy have been implemented since the 80s have introduced a significant backlash due to growing public criticism against the multicultural ideology accused somehow instrumentally of having produced dangerous social fragmentation. Above all, populist, xenophobic, and instrumental criticism has grown, especially targeted against migration, depicted as a cultural threats to national identities and security. These are affected by the emerging public feeling of hostility to intercultural approaches, too often accompanied by explicit racist attitude. But beyond instrumental criticism, reinforced by populism and this emerging new xenophobic right across Europe, uh, multiculturalism has been also criticized with far more solid arguments by scholars and intellectuals of various backgrounds. These have raised academic criticism aimed at overcoming the excesses of culturalism and emphasize the need to also include the social dimension in educational debate on diversity. The growing post cultural trend in education policies has favored the establishment of an integration policy model based on civic integration combined with restriction of immigration and naturalization processes. This model prioritizes civic education programs, which aim at the social integration, in particular of individuals with a migrant background, into a national culture, values, and beliefs, takes as homogeneous. In the book, Torres and I argue some responses to those criticisms But beyond the fact that this theme of cultural diversity and intercultural education still is at the core of educational policy and practice, I argue the need to move beyond the culturalist perspective that have shaped many of the approaches of intercultural education. A backlash toward a civicism based on supposed national identities, as many education reform unfortunately propose, is not a proper response because it simply avoids the problem in its overall framework. But I argue that addressing global issues such as recognition of cultural diversity, often generated by migration, global pedagogical and educational policy are needed. As the French sociologist Michel Vieux-Vorca maintained, it's not this or that model that is obsolete. It is the very concept of national model of integration that has historically failed. Unlike traditional model of citizenship education, global citizenship education could offer a new lens to reframe the conundrums and contradiction of citizenship in today's plural society shaped by diversity in a globalized and interconnected world, taking into account both equality and human rights as well as differences. Moreover, with this scenario, global scenario, the problems and opportunities generated by the exchange between cultural diversity are structurally linked to other, only apparently distant challenges such inequality, poverty, and environmental sustainability. Ultimately, global citizenship education can be seen as a natural development of intercultural education, which, however, is not denied, but simply reconceptualized and sublimated within a broader frame of reference. But what is global citizenship education, and especially what is global citizenship education in Europe? This concept is a very semantically indefinite one, widely and differently conceptualized in the last few years, open to many different interpretations, but which can be posed on two different poles, two different extremes. On the one hand, it is understood as an approach suitable for the preparation of global elite to a flexible and competitive global labor market, forming human capital for the international knowledge economy. On the other hand, it can be understood as a way to challenge global inequality, providing a pedagogy for global social justice. As I have argued elsewhere, I embrace a non neutral global social justice framework, which considers global citizenship education not only a new educational content as a mere extension of citizenship concept from the national to the global level, but following the UNESCO view as a framing paradigm, a new perspective that allows policymakers and practitioners to reconceptualize all issues within a new educational perspective to frame theoretically and methodologically different types of knowledge, abilities, and values. In other words, it offered a new angle combining intercultural, multicultural education with a perspective of education to environmental sustainability and providing new meanings to the problems of citizenship in global, plural, and heterogeneous societies. Such an holistic approach is regarded as a single educational response able to interconnect diverse global issues and current challenges like migrations, inequality, human rights, and environmental issues. It also makes possible to encompass different national policy, to mobilize international cooperation, and therefore it can support a transformational agenda and the pursuit of a global social justice. So, what is the impact for teacher education? For my own previous research, teacher education emerged as a key indicator for effective policy implementation. Moreover, initial but also in-service teacher education are considered by UNESCO an enabling factor contributing to successful delivery of global citizenship education. More broadly, some scholars, both in Europe and in North America, observe that the lack of a systematic and diffuse intervention in teacher education is one of the main causes for the feebleness of education policy for promoting diversity and inclusion. Not to mention that teacher education is also incorporated as indicator indicator number 1, letter C, of the targets 4.7 in the SDG Agenda 2030. Unfortunately, I have no time enough to provide example of a practice, but I just mentioning two examples of practice in which I experimented this approach. The first was about teaching global citizenship education course in higher education as a cross-cutting discipline, and the second is about an intercultural teacher education program based on the results of a comparative research carried out between Italy and USA. I'm happy to provide any reference to these two research, but I have no time for go too much in detail in this, and I have to conclude my this initial speaking. Uh, Research confirms that educating teachers in global citizenship education rests primarily of achieving teachers' agency, following Priestley, Bista, and another, and empowering teachers as agent of change. A value-based experiential pedagogical approach is a major driver in this process and is fundamental to engage teachers in the promotion of school change. On the contrary, teacher education based on the mainstream culture of performativity, rigid prescriptive curricula, and oppressive regime of testing, as Gerbesta defined it, tend to inhibit the so-called teacher agency. Teachers' active contribution to shape their work and actively influence learning processes has been regarded as a key factor to promote school change and to include global citizenship education as a new educational perspective framing theoretically and methodologically different types of knowledge, abilities, and values. Against this background, teacher education is crucial, not only to provide teachers with knowledge and competence required to educating students, but also can be regarded as an enabling factor for contributing to successfully deliver global citizenship education and its related issue. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to have further opportunity to have a real face-to-face on online exchange.